Join us for this great conversation with Rick Schmidt, who knew Tommy Bolin from his earliest days in Denver in the late 60s, but was also the bass player in Dave Brown and the Brown Brothers' great band, Hannigan's Greenhouse. I am so excited today in our ongoing quest to tell the deep Tommy Bolin story to have Rick Schmidt here. And Rick is going to fill in some gaps that are just crucial when it comes to the Denver music scene in the late 1960s, which of course is where Tommy came in the fall of 1967 and was immediately embraced by the who's who of what was in fact the developing Denver music scene. So Rick, welcome. I'm just thrilled you're here.
So nice to meet you, Michael.
And so you were a Denver native. Tell us a little bit about how you got hooked into wanting to be a musician and what was going on.
I actually come from what I would call a showbiz family, although my mother, her stage name was Livy Taylor. She was a Mozart type pianist who really grew to be a fantastic jazz pianist. She did classical too, but she was a gigging musician, and quite along with my dad, his stage name was Bob Damon. Robert Schmidt was his name, but he was actually a professional magician. And but they moved to Denver, which was probably a mistake for their careers. But so Dad had to get a job, a real job, but he always was a magician, and my mom was always a musician, and I was around what I like to call high information music, uh, you know, from the womb, pretty much. She played like Art Tatum, Oscar Peterson, Errol Garner, that style of piano, you know. And she worked, and she was all kind of on the sub list to back up Johnny Smith, who was a very famous guitar player who had a gig in Capitol Hill, who had hits. He actually wrote "Walk Don't Run," but has a Gibson guitar named after him. But so at any rate, I was always around music. My mom wanted me to play upright bass, so I briefly did. Um, but then the Ed Sullivan Show happened, and that was the day that, the Monday morning afterwards, everybody at my junior high school were forming bands, out on the playground.
In Denver, where were you?
In Denver, that was Grant Junior High School in South Denver on Pearl Street, which is, that street is kind of part of this whole thing, at least with the Brown Brothers and the early hippie scene in Denver. Um, so so that was it, and I was in, I had a little band that I started, and I wanted to play bass, but I didn't get a bass for a while, electric bass, and I fully became I was what 13, so I was approaching puberty, and I discovered the Beatles, and you know how that worked, so it was like, yeah, I want to do what they do, and so that's pretty much the very beginning of my music thing. I studied, and I learned. I would, as long as I've been reading music all my life, I'm still a pretty terrible reader, but it still serves me well for certain gigs. And but I wanted to be a rock and roller, and I didn't really, other than my mother's love for jazzy blues, I didn't really get into blues until I met, um, Jeff Cook and Don DeBacker a little bit later on, but we'll get to that. Um, so that's about it. But as you know, not that long after the Beatles, they became more hippied out, and so did I. And of course there were definitely the reasons for that. And but it was just at a time. It was a great time that I'm so glad I lived through. You know.
And so people, other musicians of the same age, had the same influences, were doing the same things, both in
Right.
terms of having bands and then smoking pot, potentially taking LSD, whatever it was. And people would all coalesce around that. So how did all those steps happen to where you got hooked up with Dave, Rick, and Alan Brown?
Well, man, I really wish I could tell you the definitive moment for that, because I kind of, there's a lot because of probably all that other stuff I don't remember. but we were just, I know that Rick and Alan went to Grant Junior High School. I think David was a year older than me, and I don't think he ever went there. I don't really know whether he was a dropout. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. But so I met them. Just how you meet people in junior high school. Oh yeah, let's let's play some music. You like the Beatles? I love the Beatles. You like the Yardbirds? I love the Yardbirds. And so I'm really not all. I don't remember the exact moments that we met. I just kind of saw the dynamic. They really had a great dynamic, and as the Beatles, they all had a persona. Ricky didn't play anything, but Alan played rhythm and kind of held a guitar like John Lennon and kind of sang and looked like John Lennon, and David was really into George Harrison and did all that, and Ricky, and so they all had a really good harmony blend, and they knew a lot of the Beatles songs, and we learned like early Bee Gees even back in their basement. Uh,
So you
so
then were part of, you were then hanging out with them, jamming. However,
yeah,
you all hooked up, and of course, you would then
yeah,
just wind up hanging out.
yeah. And the thing about David, and it's probably true with Alan and Ricky too, but David was very creative, very artistic. He's an incredible artist. But I didn't have an electric bass at that point, and I think David, the first thing that I had played, David said, "Come over and play this bass that I." He turned like a Silvertone Sears cheapo guitar into a four-string bass, and he like changed the nut and everything, and I remember he painted it some funky color, and so it was a four-string bass. So all of a sudden, I had a bass guitar to play, anytime I wanted. So I would get over there, and I was already aware of upright bass, and I've got music in me. So it from my mom, and so I was pretty quick. I was a pretty quick study in that at that point, and so I did that. And we played a lot of little gigs. I kind of amazed that we did. Don't know if we got paid. Don't know how we got through a whole night's worth of music, but I know we did.
You know what years? When were the first year? Was it 66, 67?
Well, I would probably maybe 66. I graduated in 69 from
Yep,
high school,
me too.
and and I was playing with them then to some extent. I might have been 66, 67, 68. You know,
And was it?
uh,
Were you part of Hannigan's Greenhouse?
yes, I was.
Which was
I was one of the
talk about
original members.
talk about Hannigan's Greenhouse.
Well, that was the band of the Browns. That's how we started. That was the name. That was the only name that I remember us having. There was an actual greenhouse up on Evans Street named Hannigan's Greenhouse. I
And
think it was a
Pearl, right?
bicycle shop. Yeah, maybe so.
I think
It was on
so.
Evans, and you know, I, I was going to Denver, because my mom was living and I had to help her. I was going back there a few times a year. She's no longer with us, but so I drive by that thing every day and I go, Hannigan's Greenhouse. There you are. That, and of course, that was the era when everybody liked the Strawberry Alarm Clock. All the people were just trying to come up with a name for their band. And but yeah, so I met all those guys, and
So
I wish I could remember the exact moment.
who all was in Hannigan's Greenhouse?
Okay, it was the Brown Brothers, me on bass. We had a drummer who just passed. His name was Stevie Allmiller, and he also played a little guitar, and he eventually became a Hammond player. And sadly, he just passed. And then there was another guy named Stephen Obar we got later. He played we wanted a piano in the group. So he was able to buy a little keyboard that probably weighed 200 pounds. Or it might have been a Wurlitzer, but this is where my memory fails me. But,
And
and
so,
that was pretty much it. And we would we had some little places we would play, and We'd go to Eagle, Colorado and play a gig, that kind of stuff.
So what was the repertoire?
I would say mostly Beatles, mostly the pop music of the time. Nothing, nothing like blues particularly. Um, Except for I think we did do a couple Stones songs. Um, we did. I remember we did some Bee Gees.
Because they
Um,
just literally came out in
yeah,
'67, and now
right,
with the Bee Gees documentary, they talk about three brothers having unique harmonies as only brothers can have.
right,
What can you
exactly.
say about the Browns as a
Well,
harm?
they definitely had because the music they were always listening to music. I mean, David was such a complete fan, of music, and so he would be playing things. I can't tell you all the albums I heard for the first time, Axis, that kind of stuff, and would because of David, kind of, and so when I met them, they had already had that stuff together. You know, they already knew Beatle stuff, Nowhere Man, stuff like that, and
So when you first started jamming and you guys would rehearse,
yeah.
what were your thoughts? What were you thinking when you're hearing the harmonies and just what these guys were doing? What do you remember?
I I don't know whether I was thinking. I was just experiencing it, and I was really digging it. I know that it was, and there's an old line that one of the reasons I dug them so much is because they dug me so much. But that's not really how I think about it. But they liked me. I was original. I was immediately part of the clan.
And who doesn't
And
like somebody who can come in and be a really good bass player pretty quick?
yeah, yeah, and bass to me is still the most important thing in a band, really, in a lot of ways. As far as the general architecture of what goes down.
So you
But
guys so you were doing, like you said, up in Eagle, Colorado, the little rooms or whatever. What were some of the places you can remember
man, I wish I
potentially?
could tell you. And it went from there was a place on Broadway that was kind of like when it wasn't South Broadway, it was just a funky places. I remember I remember we played a place in Five Points one time called the Happening Center, and everybody besides us, we were the only white guys in the place playing for a gig, and I don't know how we got booked on this gig, and we clearly did not do any the stuff that was popular, any of the Motown or James Brown or any of that stuff. We would just do what we did, and everybody had do rags, and we were just long haired hippies, from South Denver, and yet it went over really well, and everybody was really nice to us, and it really made me feel like more of a musician at that point. Besides the fact that as a bass player, I was starting to become aware of like James Jamerson and the Motown, you know, genius that played all those bass lines, and so I became more aware of that. So we eventually tried to do some of that stuff. I don't know. I don't remember if we ever actually pulled it off, but yeah. So, and then of course the hippie thing started coming into thing. The summer of love. In
Which
fact,
was
I think I
'67,
yeah
right?
I think I was actually at the Brown House watching the Smothers Brothers on a Sunday night when they first talked about the summer of love and hippies and flower children and all of that stuff, and I didn't really quite know. That was the first time I ever really heard about that stuff.
And then there started being be-ins at
Right.
there was one at City Park, I know, and then Wash Park
Yeah.
wound
Well,
up.
we played the one at Wash Park. We were one of the opening bands, and to this day, I still think we played the one in City Park, but I don't know whether we did or not. But the Dead played there, Captain Beefheart played there. The group that was I forget their names. They were used to be the Moonrakers, um, the Beggars Opera Company or something like that,
Yeah.
and they turned into Sugarloaf eventually. The band Sugarloaf.
So, of course, Wash Park is in South Denver. It's the
Right.
hood. It's where you guys
Yeah.
were all from,
Right.
and it was quite the scene back starting in
Right.
'67.
They didn't have all the streets blocked off. They had a they had a little bridge to Monkey Island. I don't know if you're familiar with Monkey
Yep.
Island,
Yep.
but that's where we all go and do our weed, and
And so let's try to talk a little bit just about that be-in, that scene, because something was going on there like all the time. It wasn't just when there was a be-in.
right. Well, the being the official one, its name was the Love America Rally. That was the name. And there was a guy on South Pearl Street who everybody knew him as Mana Pardehaten. He was an Apache or had Apache blood. I think his name was actually Manuel Trujillo or something like that. Uh, but he lived on the very end of Pearl Street by Bucktail, and he had a kind of a compound, two houses, and he had nailed a bunch of baby dolls to the front of this house. His whole house now wasn't painted. He had baby dolls on it, and he made a living out of what they call greenware pottery, which is kind of poured pottery. And so I kind of got it hung around there a little bit. Once again, I don't know if I got paid, you know. I had a girlfriend so I hung around with her. But he's the guy that founded this whole thing, the Love America rally, and him and a lot of the guys from the Family Dog. That's when I first heard about them.
But then that actually opened in September of 67 is when the dog opened.
Right, I was there.
So
Yeah.
then this would have been a month or two before that
Yes.
happened.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
people who were there part of this wound up being part of the dog.
Right. It was. Yeah, and it's funny. There was one day I was working or I was talking to my girlfriend at the place, just sanding this pottery stuff that they eventually painted. Uh, and all of a sudden, this little entourage of like psychedelic painted cars, and out pops this guy who I didn't recognize, but it was Timothy Leary. and I was out this guy and asked for mana and everything, and so Timothy Leary and they all came in. Mana was there hugging him, and Mana, by the way, had some notoriety in Denver because he got busted for peyote by a really overzealous cop named John Gray. And it was a big deal. They were really trying to nail him because he was a big hippie force in the Denver area. And he got out because he claimed, I mean, he was a member of what they call the First Native American Church or First American Church or something like that, which was, I think, a Native American thing. And so Mana got, off. He didn't get busted. And so it so yeah, so he was the guy that put together the Love America Be-In thing, which was a full-on hippie deal in Wash Park, kind of near that back lake with that big green building.
And again, you guys were on the bill. Do you remember who the other band, some of them, who was on
I
that
just
bill?
remember that there was the Beggars Opera Company there too, who were the Moonrakers, and I remember I cut my foot. I stepped on a bottle. I cut my foot, and the person who patched up my foot was Odetta, the famous Odetta.
The folk singer.
Yeah, and I wish I could tell you all the other names. I was probably higher than a kite. But it was a big, it was. I just remember the experience of it all. It was just beautiful.
Well, how
I
many?
wish I could
What
tell you.
was it? Do you remember the crowd or what the whole vibe was?
Oh yeah, it was full on, love, peace and love, absolutely. Bubbles and God's eyes and peace signs and tie dye and the whole bit. And it was and a lot of public display of affection and really cute girls for a guy my age, that kind of stuff.
And
And
so and so Hannigan's Greenhouse was one of the opening acts
Yeah,
this day.
yeah.
And what was the lineup that day? Can you
I wish I
remember?
could tell you, man. I'm
You were
so
on
sorry.
bass.
I was on bass. Oh, the band. Yeah, the band.
Yeah, not
For
the other bands.
sure.
You guys.
For sure, it was the Brown Brothers, me on bass, and Stevie L. Miller on drums. Maybe this guy Steve Obar on piano. I don't remember that either. Sorry.
No, no,
There's a
don't
lot of
listen.
gaps.
Stop apologizing. This is
Okay,
implicit.
there's a lot of gaps. But yeah, but yeah, that's what it was. And I remember, well, this is another gap. I remember, we had Silvertone amps, the Sears amps, and which, everybody wanted better amps. This is kind of before Marshalls. This was when everybody
Would have had
was,
Ampegs, right?
yeah, Ampegs and Fenders, and
Fenders, yes.
and I had an Ampeg, but it might not have been with them. But at any rate, uh, we did that, but we had these Silvertone, and there was a song, and I'm pretty sure we did this in that thing called by Love, the band Love, called Seven and Seven Is. And there's a big thing where there's a big explosion in the end of it. I think they probably had a soundbite of a nuclear or a bomb or something. Well, David took the head, which had reverb on top of the amp, and he just banged it into the top of the thing, and it was like everybody go, "Oh, wow, that's trippy." And
So, okay, here's Hannigan's Greenhouse. You're the bass player. Come on, this is like the first. Nobody's played at a show like this before,
kind
where
of,
there's
no, I know.
hundreds, thousands of people, whatever.
Yeah, I would say probably 1,000. You know,
But still, I
uh,
mean, this is
yeah,
the
yeah,
beginning of the potential festival type vibe.
right, absolutely.
So, do you have any remembrance of the crowd, or just you guys up there playing, and with just what the
I
scene
I
was?
just remember just kind of being in there. It was like I say, it was my first real hippie thing, and it was so beautiful. It was not, that was before, drugs, when drugs were all about enlightenment and self-awareness, right? And not about getting screwed up. And, I don't, there was no negative ultimate vibe going on. It was all hippies, kind of Woodstocky. I don't know when Woodstock was exactly, but it was before that.
August '69. Yeah.
Yeah. It was definitely so. It was before that, and I've looked, I've Googled. So when you find out the information about, if you can find it out, I would love to know more of myself about this, because I've tried to find Mana. There's a little bit about him, because he was actually a big force in that whole early hippie scene.
Yeah, and for Timothy Leary to know him,
Right.
that he was the
And
Denver
partially because
guy.
of his notoriety that he was a peyote devotee, and yeah. So I remember the first night when Timothy Leary came in. Another guy came in named Chet Helm.
Chet Helms, yep.
Yeah, Chet Helms, and he was talking about. I guess he was the editor of a newspaper. Am I
No,
right?
no, Chet had Avalon Productions in San Francisco,
Oh,
and
okay.
he was managing a number of acts, including Big Brother and the Holding Company.
Right, and
And,
I
and
remember he.
he became a major force in San Francisco. And that's
Right,
who Barry Fay went out and met that summer, because he was out shopping a band to see if he can get him a gig in San Francisco. And the light bulb went off. Hey, why don't we open a club in Denver? And Chet Helms' company was called Family Dog Productions.
right.
So then the idea was, well, we'll call it the Family Dog. So Barry and Chet formed a partnership that was how the Family Dog got started.
I did not know that.
Yep,
That's
and this is
interesting.
part of all of our research here. And it opened in September, and
I
immediately
was there. I'm pretty sure I was there for the first one.
was Big Brother.
Big Brother, Blue Cheer,
Yep,
maybe Quicksilver. I'm not sure.
they may have come, and that was all because of Chet. Chet was a happening in San Francisco. Bill Graham was happening.
Right,
Chet was happening. Chet
right,
was known as a really sweet, loving, kind of the whole spirit of that era, where Bill Graham, of course, was thought of in a different way, a little more ruthless.
right,
And so Barry and Chet opened the Family Dog, and that Officer Gray you just mentioned then targeted the Family Dog too, because
right.
he was on a mission to stop the counterculture, which of course failed miserably. But they were going to give it their best shot. So they harassed the hell out of the family dog. And then because of other irregularities, quote unquote, Chet pulled out 4 months later
Oh,
at the end of December. And then it became just the dog, and Barry wound up continuing it because
that's the
this
part I don't remember. I always called it the family dog. Okay.
because they had to because the family dog was Chet Helms's name, and they had all those amazing posters that Chet sourced from all the
Right.
great poster artists in San Francisco
Rick
from
Griffin.
September to December. Starting in January, the posters all of a sudden became nothing special because the
Ah,
whole Chet Helms connection
that's really interesting. There was an
evaporated.
African American guy, Tony
Yep,
something.
yep, yep.
Um, and there wasn't some counterculture newspaper guy too that was at that first meeting there. Walter Boart or something. I don't know.
So let's
But
talk about the dog there, just in terms of you, because of course anybody who was like you guys, the Browns, people who were on the really into the music scene from that whole era would have immediately been going to the family dog because all of a sudden
absolutely
San Francisco was in Denver. Is kind of what it
right.
boils down to.
And I could ride my bicycle there, you know, and it was uphill on Evans, but now I think it's a strip joint. But
No, it's been hasn't even been that for quite a while,
oh, really? Okay.
I
I think
believe.
I'm wondering. I don't remember this, but before it was the dog, I think it was another teen club
Is it
called the
called
Rugged Room.
or they might have had many names. Posh, I think, was one of them.
Posh, that's what it was. The Rugged Room was something else, but I went there too, and uh, yeah. So I was there, and and once again, I don't know whether I ever got paid, but I remember pushing a broom and cleaning up the next day at those places just so I could kind of be around for sound check. And of course, I remember the very first time I went in there in the afternoon, which was the first day. I just never heard a band as loud as Blue Cheer. Never seen anything like it. They were like this, and their hair was, and
That was the idea, right?
I don't know whether it was three or four dual showmans for each the bass player and the guitar player. And it was just loud. We were just going, wow, this is amazing. And so yeah,
And Cream played there.
Cream played there. I was there. They actually had a false start. They had a breakdown of some amp. Uh, and yeah, I saw Howlin' Wolf. I saw the Doors twice. Once was magical. The second one was very sad. Uh, I saw a lot of people that I can barely remember. Tracy Nelson and that band,
Mother Earth.
Mother Earth. Yeah, and more than I can really honestly remember. It's kind of sad.
But somewhere in the middle of all that, right, that period, September, October, November, is when Tommy Bolin arrived in Denver
Right.
because he wanted to, you know, make it. He wanted to become a star because he went to
Right.
see Elvis at 5 years old in Sioux City, and it was like that was it. And he came here already developed into this complete genius maestro guitar player, knowing how to play Purple Haze,
Right.
and came and what immediately was also hanging out at the family dog. So this you cross paths at this time period. When can you what do you remember about then just all of a sudden becoming aware of Tommy Bolin?
Well, I didn't become aware of him at the Family Dog. I mean, until a little bit later. I became aware of him at the Folklore Center and the City Park, or not City Park, but the Civic Center Park. And there'd be a circle of people. He'd have somebody's borrowed acoustic guitar and playing, and and then I did hear American Standard once, and this was kind of before I actually met Jeff. Um, Jeff was in a band called the Crosstown Bus, and I know they played at some of the BNs. They might have played at the same one, Now that I think
I
about it.
think they did because he talked about being so blown away by Hannigan's greenhouse. Literally.
Well, yeah, well that's amazing. And Jeff had he was kind of the manager of I'm pretty sure he was the manager of the Folklore Center at that time.
Of the
So he
record
was
store, I think the
of the
record
record
store.
store. He
Yep.
was always very up on everything. And I thank God for Jeff Cook. I wish I could tell him in person, but Jeff, wherever you are, thank you so much.
He's in Atlanta.
You turned me on to so many things. I mean, are you experienced? Mose Allison, Albert King, stuff that, is part of you know, my DNA now. Uh, and then, of course, Don DeBacker was another guy we'll talk about later,
Yep.
who was, a big part of that because he taught lessons there.
So this time when you're seeing Tommy in City Park and Folklore Center, any way to put it when that was? What time of the year it was?
Well, I wish I could. I know it probably wasn't the winter. I probably wouldn't be just hanging around outside in the winter down there in those days. Back in those days, I was still going to high school, and my hair would grow long in the summer, where I would be cool. And then in the winter, if they made me cut it, I was always a pretty good kid, so I never really got in trouble. So my hair actually got to be fairly long for a guy that was actually still in school. And of course now it's like
Born in 1951, so there you go.
yeah.
The
Well,
passage of time.
yeah. Well, I'm going surfing next week, so um,
So what was your first impressions of when Tommy would have this acoustic guitar and
well, I mean, honestly, I didn't think about it. I might because at that point I was kind of digging into guitar too, which sort of upset a lot of people because they wanted a bass player. They didn't want another guitar player, But I was, through Don, and I was getting into guitar, and so I was probably a little competitive to him. Fast forward from there, the first time I saw him was Zephyr. I went home and threw up. It was like he was so great. But
I
that's
actually want to fast backwards because we didn't really
okay.
talk about Dave Brown, the guitar player.
Yes,
And maybe was that an inspiration for you?
absolutely.
Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. Well, David really made a point of trying to learn the parts on the records. That was one thing. It wasn't so much about improvising. When he would improvise on some songs, like that love song I was mentioning, it would be, more psychedelic-y stuff, but he would learn the Beatles parts, and and that just impressed me. That how do you do this? Even though I knew my mother could totally do that, with anything on piano. Uh, but I just was somebody almost. David was a year older than me, I believe, and but he just seemed like he was, a generation ahead of me, and so I always, was kind of the cool guy, the bigger, older guy, and but as a guitar player, he was great, and I remember, he had they had like a Silvertone guitar. I forget what his first guitar that I saw him playing, but then I remember, back in the Byrds days, I mean, my first Byrds record was, I listened with David and Alan and Ricky, and so David somehow his parents were very supportive, and so they bought him a 12-string Rickenbacker, like like Jim McGuinn, and so all of a sudden then we were doing Beatles songs with the 12-string sound and Byrds songs and stuff like that, and and they sounded right, you know, from what I remember, they sounded right, and and he was so into it, he was so gung ho into it, and I think when he saw Tommy eventually, all of a sudden he kind of, just like I almost did, he kind of went, "Oh, I'm never going to be able to do that." I did say that about Tommy, and I kind of went a different path. But like my steel guitar, that's amazing. But
And that's kind of what I figured was that that's why David basically retired from having any interest in pursuing being a musician, I believe,
Yeah, well,
because
it was just
he then became Tommy's tech, his guy, his man.
and he was very good at that. He was very knowledgeable and not afraid to experiment. And like for instance, that Bigsby on that Les Paul. I think he put that on there. But at any rate, yeah. So
So
David was an eye opener. I mean, the whole Brown family were eye openers for me. And even though I came from a pretty hip family actually myself, but they weren't just Leave It to Beaver, but there was a lot of love there, and the love of music, and and we would just listen to these records, and we would just really mentally take note of everything about them. It was a big learning experience for me to know the Brown brothers.
because I know that the Tommy piece and American Standard that got American Standard started doing gigs there, and because Jeff
Right.
formed, as soon as Tommy knocked on the door where they were, Crosstown Bus was rehearsing, and begged Jeff to let him come in, and they played Purple Haze, and then Jeff had to go find Tommy, um,
Yeah.
to say, hey, I want to form a new band with you. And so
Uh-huh.
American Standard got launched, and immediately were getting booked. They were booked at a show up in Aspen right away. They, of course, did a number of shows at the Family Dog, and they were scheduled to open for Otis Redding in December of '67 at the Family Dog, and Otis died
Right. Yeah.
a week or late earlier in the plane crash
Wow.
outside Madison. And that poster, they created the poster. Talk about a collector's item, and that never occurred. And it's, so anyway, Tommy had already made such a big impression in American Standard that they were booked to be the opening act, the only one for that Otis Redding show, just a matter of months after Tommy had arrived in Denver. So, can you speak to that phenomenon at all about
Well,
just how quickly he was able to get people to notice him?
as soon as you heard him, you noticed him. Absolutely. I mean, the first time I think I saw him with American Standard, and I didn't see all the shows. I only think I saw one or maybe two. Um, but I remember he had like this big fur hat on, and he definitely didn't dress like any scroungy hippie. He definitely looked like somebody different, And I believe at that time he had a gold top Les Paul that he slung pretty low. Um, and I don't remember the bass player drummer, um, but I remember Jeff. Jeff was just like, wow, this guy really got his own thing, and they had charisma and stage presence and professionality, not to mention music, you know. Hold on, I have to just mention one thing to my wife. Yeah, hold on a second. Doing the interview. Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
Um,
because there's just not a lot of people who remember seeing American
yeah,
Standard.
yeah, and that was before I knew Jeff, because I was still playing with the Browns at that point. I think. Once again, my memory fails me.
Well, that would
But
have been just that fall, still, in
yeah,
theory, or at the beginning
yeah,
of the next year.
and I remember. Well, yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead of anything, but
Yeah.
I just remember seeing Tommy with that band and just thinking, oh my God, he's fantastic.
Do you
And
remember them doing Purple Haze?
you know what? I probably do, but I don't. I can't. If only I could just take a video of my brain. But it's.
And of course,
But I
there's
just
no.
remember they were doing bluesy stuff, and that was kind of the first rock bluesy stuff I really had heard other than some of the other acts at the Family Dog. But they were, they were a three piece, and which somebody might find me wrong there too. But
No,
it's
they were. And Jeff was the vocalist.
yeah, and okay, so it was a four piece. Yeah, so I remember I heard
Guitar,
later on
bass, drums,
guitar,
and
bass, and
Jeff.
drums, and Jeff. Yeah, that's right. And I remember that I had heard from Jeff later that they got the name American Standard from a toilet seat. They were trying to name their band, and they stopped at a place to use a toilet. And American Standard, they all came out going, "Whoa, that's a great name." So, but yeah, I don't remember anything more than that. I just remembered that it was exciting, and it was cutting edge. It was loud. It was uh, it was bluesy, which I didn't really know what bluesy was at that point. It was just something that was like, oh, got my attention for sure. And Tommy, really got my attention, needless to say. But later on, he got it more when we actually got to know each other fairly well. And
So, so Rick, I hate to do this. I have a doctor's appointment that I have to run to, and this is
okay,
kind of a good, I think, good point to stop for now. But we're gonna have to go into part two to where we can really dig deeper into you getting to know Tommy and more about the guitars and Dave,
yeah,
and just all that transpired. Because I know you've got stories that if you haven't told them, they haven't been
I haven't
told.
told him, and I haven't written that book yet.
But
Well,
this is just amazing because it was a magic time for music, and to
absolutely.
hear the roots of how the San Francisco scene had come to Denver, and then with the Family Dog had really uh, came to Denver, and that this is exactly when Tommy came here. And how did he know? It was just as all
That I've
circumstance.
never heard that story. I've never heard. I guess it was a close big hub to Sioux City, or you know,
Well, Sioux City was a dead end at that point. He was
yeah,
running into the same resistance there that people in Denver were running into, but Denver had a way bigger scene.
right,
And the bands in Sioux City that were making any money were all just cover bands who wore suit and ties.
right.
And it was that summer when everything just went crazy. When acid came in, Jimi Hendrix blew up, and Tommy wanted to get out of Sioux City. He actually wanted to, not hang out there. He didn't want to be. There were a number of things going on there that he wanted to get away from. I don't want to go too in
Right.
depth to that, but coming to Denver, uh, Brad Miller, who had been in Patch Blue in Sioux City, I don't know if you ever met Brad. He had already come to Denver, and he was working at a local a band, not a cover band, but a band booking agency.
Oh,
And he had encouraged Tommy to come
oh, really?
because he
Oh,
could then potentially help plug Tommy in. Um, and then Brad formed the group Sky King.
I remember that name. I think I've heard that band. Yeah.
Yep. And they would
Boy,
open up
it's been
for
a long time
Zephyr.
since I've even heard that name.
They would open
Wow.
for Zephyr, and I saw them play a few times.
Okay, maybe yeah.
And that was
Okay.
part of what drew Tommy to Denver. But the timing was just unbelievable because Denver was just blowing up. And there you were right in the middle of it with the Browns. So let's get our calendars out here once we end the call here, and we'll figure out the next time soon that we can do part two of this. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure. I mean, it's nice to be, you're helping me remember some of the things because this really was a very important part of my life too. I mean, it really was the Browns, Tommy, Jeff.
okay, everybody, stay tuned for part two with Rick Schmidt coming soon.